The frozen window panes showed nothing but white chaos outside, but inside Jakob Werner's cabin, warm golden light glowed upward through the rectangular opening in his floor. What neighbors had mocked as Werner's foolish hole for 8 months was now the only reason 17 people would survive the next 4 days. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier survival stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unexpected than this one. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of wind that had been blowing without pause for 63 hours. Jakob Werner sat beside his wife Anna's body, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and understood with absolute clarity that conventional wisdom had killed her. The fire in their stone hearth had burned continuously since the storm began, consuming their entire winter wood supply in less than 3 days. The heat rose straight up the chimney and disappeared into the Wyoming night. The gaps between the cabin logs, chinked with the standard mixture of mud and moss, allowed wind to penetrate despite Jakob's best efforts at maintenance. The single window, covered with oiled paper, provided almost no insulation. The dirt floor radiated cold upward from the frozen earth beneath. Everything about their cabin followed the accepted patterns of frontier construction, built the way every settler built, using techniques passed down without question. Anna had been healthy 3 days earlier when the blizzard arrived in mid-January of 1847. The temperature had dropped to what Jakob estimated was -15 degrees, possibly colder. The wind made accurate assessment impossible, but he knew it was the coldest weather he had experienced in 4 winters on the frontier. They had stayed close to the fire, burning wood faster than Jakob had anticipated. By the second day, he realized their supply would not last. By the 3rd day, the fire had consumed the last log. Without heat, the cabin interior temperature dropped rapidly. Anna, already weakened by a lingering cough from earlier in the winter, could not maintain her body warmth. She died quietly in the early hours of the 4th day, just as the storm finally began to diminish. Jakob sat motionless for hours after her death, not from grief alone, but from a realization that was reshaping everything he understood about survival. The cabin had not failed because it was poorly built. He had constructed it carefully, using solid logs, proper notching, and adequate chinking. It had failed because the fundamental design was wrong. A surface structure, no matter how well constructed, was vulnerable to temperature extremes in ways that could not be overcome with traditional methods. Heat escaped too easily, cold penetrated too readily. Wind created conditions that multiplied the danger. He thought about the root cellar he had dug the previous summer to store vegetables. Even in the deepest winter cold, the root cellar never froze. Potatoes and carrots remained perfectly preserved while surface temperatures plunged to lethal levels. The earth itself provided insulation that no amount of logs and chinking could match. He thought about miners he had met who described working underground in winter, how the tunnels remained warmer than surface camps. He thought about a trader who had built an ice house partially underground, using earth as insulation to keep ice from melting even in summer heat. A question formed in Jakob's mind that would consume the next 8 months of his life. What if the safest place during a winter storm was not a surface cabin at all, but rather a properly constructed chamber beneath the ground? Jakob buried Anna on a hillside overlooking their claim when the ground thawed enough to dig in early March. He marked the grave with stones and returned to the cabin with a purpose that felt like momentum carrying him forward, whether he chose it or not. Most widowers in his position would have left the frontier, returned to family in the east, or moved to a larger settlement where life was less isolated. Jakob stayed because he had a problem to solve, and leaving before he solved it felt like abandoning Anna a second time. He spent the spring traveling to nearby settlements and homesteads within a 2-day ride, ostensibly visiting neighbors and assessing how others had fared during the brutal winter. In reality, he was studying every structure that interacted with the earth, paying attention to temperature, moisture, and stability in ways that other men did not. At the Hartman Trading Post, 15 miles east of his cabin, he spent an afternoon examining Otto Hartman's root cellar. The structure was simple, dug 8 feet into a hillside and lined with fieldstone. Otto stored vegetables, preserved meats, and barrels of goods that required cool, stable temperatures. Jakob asked if he could take measurements and observations. Otto, curious about Jakob's intense interest, agreed. The root cellar maintained a temperature of approximately 50 degrees, regardless of external conditions. In the depths of winter, when surface temperatures dropped below zero, the cellar stayed 50 degrees. In summer heat, when surface temperatures climbed above 90, the cellar remained 50 degrees. The earth provided insulation that was superior to any material Jakob could build with. More importantly, the temperature stability was passive. It required no heating in winter and no cooling in summer. The earth itself did the work. Jakob visited a small mining operation 30 miles north where men extracted silver from a hillside. He talked his way into touring the tunnels, claiming interest in mining techniques. What he really wanted to understand was the thermal environment underground. The miners confirmed what he suspected. Even in the coldest months, the tunnels remained comfortably warm. Once you descended past the first 20 feet, men worked in shirt sleeves underground, while surface temperatures froze exposed skin in minutes. The miners attributed this to body heat and lamp heat, but Jakob recognized that the earth itself was providing the baseline warmth. At a remote homestead, he found a family of Swedish immigrants who had built a partially underground dwelling, something they called a backstuga. The structure had a conventional log cabin front, but the rear half was built into a hillside with earth piled against and over the walls. The family explained that in Sweden, this design was common in regions with harsh winters. They had endured the same blizzard that killed Anna, and while they had been uncomfortable and frightened, they had never been in danger of freezing. Their design, primitive compared to what Jakob was beginning to envision, had kept them alive, using far less firewood than a conventional cabin required. Jakob also sought out an old French trapper named Baptiste who lived in a hide-covered pit house near a creek. The structure was almost entirely underground, accessed by a ladder through a smoke hole in the roof. Baptiste had lived this way for 12 winters and claimed he burned less wood in a full winter than most settlers burned in a month. The interior was cramped and dark, but undeniably warm. Jakob spent an evening there, measuring dimensions and observing construction details while Baptiste told stories of the fur trade. Each observation added detail to the concept forming in Jakob's mind. Underground spaces maintained stable temperatures. Earth provided superior insulation. Depth below the surface correlated with thermal stability. The challenge was not whether an underground space could stay warm, but whether it could be built well enough to serve as a genuine refuge, not just a crude shelter. Jakob returned to his cabin in late April of 1847 with a leather journal filled with sketches and measurements. He spent 2 weeks refining his concept, drawing and redrawing until the design satisfied both his practical requirements and his limited understanding of engineering principles. The underground room would be 10 feet deep, 12 feet wide, and 14 feet long, large enough to shelter multiple people if necessary, but small enough that one man could excavate it alone. The walls would be brick, not stone or earth. Brick would provide structural stability and create a smooth surface that could be kept clean. The ceiling would be timber beams supporting the cabin floor above, reinforced to carry the weight of people and furniture. The entrance would be a concealed hatch in the cabin floor, insulated to prevent heat loss. A wooden stairway would provide safe access, replacing the ladder that root cellars typically used. Ventilation would come through a shaft disguised as an extension of his existing chimney, allowing fresh air without creating dangerous drafts. Heat would come from a small iron stove with its own dedicated flue, requiring minimal fuel to maintain comfortable temperatures in the well-insulated space. The design was ambitious for a man working alone, but Jakob believed it was achievable. In early May, he rode to Otto Hartmann's trading post with a detailed list of materials. Otto read through the list slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion. 400 bricks, 80 pounds of mortar, 20 linear feet of iron stovepipe, 1 small iron stove designed for heating, not cooking, 40 square feet of corkboard, iron brackets and hinges, lumber cut to specific dimensions for stairs and framing. Otto set the list down and looked at Jakob directly. "What are you building?" Jakob explained the concept. An underground room beneath his cabin floor, brick-lined, properly ventilated, heated with a small stove, designed to provide refuge during extreme weather when surface structures became dangerous. He described the stable temperatures in root cellars and mine tunnels, the physics of earth insulation, the failure of conventional cabins during the storm that killed Anna. Otto listened without interrupting, then asked practical questions about drainage, structural support, and ventilation. He was a businessman, not an engineer, but he understood construction basics from years of supplying frontier builders. Some of Jakob's answers were confident. Others were admissions that he would solve problems as they arose. Otto calculated costs and delivery timeline. The bricks would need to be hauled from a kiln 40 miles south. The cork would come from street. Louis on the next supply wagon. Total cost would consume most of Jakob's savings. Delivery would take 6 weeks. Jakob agreed to the terms. Otto wrote up the order, then paused before Jakob left. "People are going to think you are crazy," he said quietly. Jakob nodded. He had already accepted that. Otto added the order to his outgoing freight list, and Jakob rode home to begin work that would occupy him until autumn. Word of the unusual order spread through the scattered settlement within days. By the time Jakob started excavating, his project already had a nickname. They called it Werner's Folly. Jakob removed 6 floorboards from the center of his cabin in late May, creating an opening 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. The exposed earth beneath was hard-packed and dry. He began digging with a short-handled spade, filling a wooden bucket, hauling it outside, dumping it, and returning for another load. The process was repetitive and exhausting. Each bucket held approximately 20 pounds of earth. He estimated he would need to remove roughly 12,000 pounds of soil to create the chamber he had designed. The first 2 feet of excavation went quickly. The earth was relatively soft, and Jakob made steady progress. By the end of the first week, he had created a pit 3 feet deep. But as he dug deeper, the work became exponentially harder. At 4 feet down, he was working in a cramped space with limited room to maneuver the shovel. At 6 feet, he needed to climb in and out of the pit using a ladder, carrying each bucket up before dumping it. At 8 feet, the walls began showing signs of instability, with small amounts of earth crumbling and falling. Jakob stopped digging and spent 3 days shoring up the walls with rough timber planks braced against the pit sides. The bracing was temporary, meant only to prevent collapse during excavation, but it was essential. A cave-in would bury him alive, and no one would find his body for days or weeks. He worked carefully, testing each wall section before continuing deeper. Karl Brenner visited in mid-June, ostensibly to borrow tools but clearly curious about the project everyone was discussing. He stood at the edge of the pit and watched Jakob haul bucket after bucket of earth up the ladder. After 20 minutes of silence, Karl finally spoke. "You have been digging for 3 weeks." Jakob dumped another bucket and descended the ladder without responding. Karl continued, louder now. "You could have built an entire cabin in 3 weeks. You could have planted crops. You could have done anything useful. Instead, you are digging a hole." Jakob filled another bucket and climbed up. Karl stepped back to let him pass. "Anna would not have wanted this," Karl said quietly. Jakob stopped, set down the bucket, and looked at Karl directly. "Anna died because our cabin could not protect her. I am building something that will protect anyone who needs it. If you think that is foolish, you are welcome to leave." Karl stared at him for a moment, then walked away without another word. By early July, Jakob had excavated to the full 10-foot depth. The pit measured 12 feet by 14 feet at the bottom, slightly larger at the top to accommodate the sloped walls he had cut to prevent collapse. He had hauled approximately 14,000 pounds of earth out bucket by bucket over 6 weeks. His hands were calloused and bleeding in places despite wrapping them with cloth. His back ached constantly. But the excavation was complete, and the materials Otto had ordered would arrive within the week. The real construction could begin. The freight wagon arrived at Otto Hartmann's trading post in the second week of July. Jakob spent 2 days hauling materials from the post to his cabin using a borrowed horse and cart. 400 bricks made 8 trips. The iron stove, stovepipe, cork, mortar, and lumber required 3 additional trips. By the time everything was staged near his cabin, Jakob had invested another week into the project. Karl Brenner watched one of the hauls pass his homestead and shook his head without speaking. Jakob had never laid brick before. He understood the basic principle of staggered joints and mortar, but he had no practical experience with the craft. He mixed his first batch of mortar according to instructions Otto had provided, applied it to the bottom course of bricks along one wall, and quickly realized the work required skill he did not possess. The mortar was too wet. The bricks slid out of alignment. The joints were inconsistent. He tore out the first attempt and started again. Friedrich Klein arrived at Jakob's cabin on a July afternoon, traveling through the territory on his way to a carpentry job in Oregon. He was a German immigrant like Jakob, skilled in multiple building trades, including brickwork. Friedrich had heard about Werner's underground room from Otto and detoured specifically to see it. He climbed down into the excavated pit, examined the dimensions, asked about drainage and ventilation plans, and offered a proposition. He would stay for 2 weeks and teach Jakob proper bricklaying technique in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. Jakob agreed immediately. Friedrich was a methodical teacher. He demonstrated how to mix mortar to the correct consistency, how to apply it evenly, how to set each brick with a slight tapping motion that seated it firmly while keeping alignment true. He showed Jakob how to use a level and plumb line to ensure walls stayed straight and vertical. They worked together on the first wall, Friedrich leading, while Jakob followed his example. By the 3rd day, Jakob was laying bricks with reasonable competence. The walls rose slowly. Each course had to cure overnight before adding the next, preventing the weight from squeezing out wet mortar below. Friedrich and Jakob established a rhythm. Mornings were spent laying brick. Afternoons were spent preparing materials, cutting lumber for the stairway, and planning ventilation details. Friedrich appreciated Jakob's systematic approach and willingness to learn. Jakob absorbed every technique Friedrich demonstrated. By the end of the first week, 3 walls were complete to half height. During the second week, they finished all 4 walls to the full height and began constructing the wooden stairway. Friedrich designed stairs with a comfortable rise and tread depth, including a handrail for safety. The stairs were anchored to the brick wall on one side and supported by posts on the other. When Friedrich departed in early August, the brick walls were complete. The stairway was functional, and Jakob understood enough about masonry and carpentry to finish the remaining work himself. Friedrich refused payment beyond meals, saying the project was worth supporting. He rode west toward Oregon, leaving Jakob to complete what they had started together. Jakob spent August completing the structural elements that would transform an underground pit into a functional refuge. The ceiling required heavy timber beams spanning the width of the chamber, spaced 18 inches apart to support the weight of the cabin floor above. He selected logs 8 inches in diameter, cut them to length, and notched them to rest securely on the brick walls. Each beam weighed approximately 120 pounds. Lifting them into position alone was difficult, requiring a makeshift pulley system he rigged using rope and a beam extended through the cabin doorway above. Once the ceiling beams were installed, he laid floorboards across them, recreating the cabin floor over the underground room. He left the rectangular opening for the hatch, 4 feet by 6 feet, positioned near the center of the cabin where it would be least obvious to casual visitors. The hatch itself required precision carpentry that tested everything Friedrich had taught him. Jakob cut planks from straight-grained pine, each one 3 inches thick. He shaped tongue and groove joints along the edges so the planks would interlock tightly when assembled. The process was tedious. Each joint had to fit precisely, or the hatch would have gaps that compromised insulation. The assembled hatch weighed nearly 80 pounds, but was rigid and gap-free. Jakob mounted it using heavy iron hinges, recessed into both the hatch and the floor frame, allowing the hatch to sit flush when closed. From above, With the hatch closed, it blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding floorboards. Only someone looking carefully would notice the seam. He installed a locking bar on the underside that could be engaged from below, providing security if needed. The cork insulation was the most expensive single component Otto had ordered. Jakob cut it into strips and attached it around the entire perimeter of the hatch frame using small nails and adhesive. The cork created a compressible seal that closed gaps when the hatch was shut, preventing airflow between the cabin and the underground room. The thermal barrier was essential. Without it, warm air from below would escape and cold air from above would infiltrate, defeating the purpose of the underground design. Ventilation required equal attention. Jakob extended his existing chimney with additional brickwork, creating what appeared to be a taller chimney, but was actually two separate flues within one structure. One flue served the cabin fireplace. The second, smaller flue connected to the underground room, providing fresh air intake. He installed a damper that could be adjusted from below, controlling airflow based on conditions. The system was passive but effective, using natural convection to circulate air. The iron stove was positioned in one corner of the underground room with its own dedicated exhaust flue running up through the cabin wall and exterior. The stove was small, designed for heating rather than cooking, and required minimal fuel. Jakob tested it with a small fire and confirmed the flue drew properly without smoking. By mid-September, the underground room was complete and functional. Jakob began stocking it with supplies: preserved food, water barrels, blankets, medical items, candles, firewood, everything someone might need during an extended refuge. The settlement held an informal gathering in early October at Otto Hartmann's trading post. These gatherings happened several times each year, providing scattered homesteaders an opportunity to trade goods, share information, and maintain the minimal social connections that frontier life allowed. Jakob attended reluctantly, knowing his project would be discussed, but recognizing that isolation served no practical purpose. He arrived in late afternoon as perhaps 20 people milled around the trading post yard. Karl Brenner saw Jakob immediately and raised his voice to ensure others could hear. Werner finally emerges from his hole. "Tell us, Jakob, how deep did you dig before you realized you were wasting your time?" Several people laughed. Jakob said nothing and moved toward the trading post entrance. Karl followed, encouraged by the audience. 8 months. That is how long you spent digging and building underground. 8 months you could have spent trapping, farming, doing anything productive. Instead, you built a cellar to live in, like an animal. Greta Brenner, Karl's wife, touched her husband's arm gently, suggesting he stop. Karl shrugged her off. He needs to hear it. Everyone is too polite to say what they think, but someone should tell him the truth. Anna's death affected his judgment. He is not thinking clearly. Jakob turned to face Karl directly. His voice was quiet but carried across the yard. "I think very clearly. I built something that will keep people alive when cabins fail. If that seems foolish to you, I hope you never learn otherwise." He walked into the trading post, ending the confrontation. The yard fell silent for a moment before conversations resumed. Inside, Otto was organizing inventory. He glanced at Jakob and gestured toward the back room where they could speak privately. Once away from others, Otto spoke carefully. "Karl is not the only one who thinks your project was excessive. Most people believe you overreacted to tragedy. They respect your loss, but they question your judgment." Jakob nodded. He had expected this. "What do you think?" Otto considered the question. "I think you built something remarkable. The engineering is sound. The materials are quality. The design is innovative. But I also think you may never need it. Storms like the one that killed Anna are rare. You may have invested 8 months preparing for something that will not happen again in your lifetime." He paused. "That does not make it foolish. It makes it cautious. But others will not see the difference." Jakob left the trading post without participating further in the gathering. He rode home under a clear October sky, knowing that his reputation in the settlement had shifted from tragic widower to eccentric recluse. People would remember him as the German who dug a hole and called it innovation. The judgment did not particularly bother him. He had not built the underground room for social approval. He had built it because conventional cabins killed people, and he refused to accept that vulnerability as inevitable. Winter would arrive soon. If the room never proved necessary, he would accept that outcome. But if another storm came, he would be ready. The first snow fell in early November of 1847, light and brief. The second storm arrived a week later and lasted 2 days, leaving 8 inches of accumulation. Neither storm concerned Jacob. They were typical early winter weather, cold but manageable. He maintained his cabin fireplace, checked his supplies, and continued routine work around his homestead. The underground room remained unused, accessible through the hatch, but not yet necessary. The third storm arrived on November 23rd with characteristics that immediately distinguished it from normal winter weather. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 hours. The wind increased from calm to sustained gale force in less than an hour. Snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Jacob was outside splitting firewood when the conditions changed. He abandoned the work, gathered the wood he had already split, and retreated inside his cabin. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped to approximately -10 degrees. By midnight, Jacob estimated it had reached -20. The wind made accurate assessment impossible, but he knew from the sound and the penetrating cold that this storm was different. His cabin fireplace provided heat, but the wind found every gap in the chinking, every imperfection in the construction. Cold air infiltrated continuously despite his best efforts to maintain warmth. Jacob made his decision at dawn on the second day. The storm showed no signs of diminishing. The wind had blown continuously for 18 hours. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls to a depth of 4 feet on the north side. The interior temperature near the fireplace was barely tolerable. Away from the fire, his breath created visible clouds. The cabin was failing in exactly the way he had anticipated. He opened the hatch in his cabin floor. Warm air rose from the underground room below, a stark contrast to the cold cabin. He descended the stairs, carrying supplies he would need for an extended stay: additional food, water, personal items, and firewood for the small stove. The underground room temperature was approximately 55 degrees without any heating. He lit a small fire in the iron stove, using minimal wood. Within an hour, the room temperature climbed to 65 degrees and stabilized. The contrast was extraordinary. Above ground, the cabin was barely habitable despite a roaring fire consuming wood rapidly. Below ground, the room was comfortable with a fire small enough to burn for hours on a single log. The earth insulation performed exactly as Jacob had calculated. The brick walls radiated gentle warmth. The ventilation system provided fresh air without creating drafts. The space was quiet, protected from the wind that howled across the surface. Jacob sat at the small table he had placed in one corner and waited. The storm would pass eventually. He had supplies for weeks if necessary. The underground room had proven its function. Whether anyone else would recognize its value remained uncertain. On the evening of the second day, he heard something unexpected, pounding on his cabin door above, desperate, urgent pounding. Someone needed help. Jacob climbed the stairs and pushed open the hatch. The cabin above was brutally cold. Ice had formed on the interior walls near the window. He crossed to the door, lifted the bar, and opened it against the force of wind. Carl and Greta Brenner stood on the threshold, wrapped in blankets and shaking violently. Their faces showed the pale, waxy appearance of advancing frostbite. They had walked nearly 2 miles through the blizzard. Jacob pulled them inside and closed the door. He did not speak. There was no time for explanations or recriminations. He guided them to the hatch and helped them. Down the stairs into the underground room, Greta could barely grip the handrail. Carl's hands were so cold he could not feel the wood. Once below, Jacob sat them near the stove and removed their frozen outer layers. He wrapped them in dry blankets from his supply and gave them warm water to drink in small amounts. Greta spoke first, her voice shaking. "Our cabin. The fire went out. We had no more wood. Carl tried to reach the woodpile outside but could not make it through the drifts. We were freezing. We would have died." Carl said nothing, staring at the brick walls and the small stove that provided more effective heat than their cabin fireplace ever had. Over the next 6 hours, more people arrived. Otto Hartmann came with his wife and young son. Louisa Bauer arrived with her 2 children, having left her cabin when the roof began showing signs of collapse under snow weight. A trapper named Georg Müller appeared half-frozen, his remote camp completely buried. Each arrival followed the same pattern. Jakob heard pounding above, climbed up, brought them down, provided warmth and basic care. By the end of the 3rd day, 17 people sheltered in Jakob's underground room. The space was crowded but not dangerously so. Jakob's design had included dimensions sufficient for multiple occupants. He managed resources carefully, rationing food and water, maintaining the stove at minimal heat levels that nonetheless kept everyone comfortable. The brick walls absorbed and radiated warmth evenly. The ventilation system prevented the air from becoming stale, despite the number of people. No one spoke about the mockery from weeks earlier. No one mentioned Werner's folly or questioned Jakob's judgment. The underground room had become the difference between life and death, and everyone present understood that without speaking it aloud. Karl Brenner helped Jakob manage the stove and supplies, working quietly alongside the man he had ridiculed. Above ground, the blizzard continued for 4 full days. Several families who remained in their cabins did not survive. Their structures, built using conventional methods, could not protect them against sustained extreme cold and wind. When the storm finally passed on the morning of November 28th, the survivors emerged from Jakob's underground room into a transformed landscape. Snow had drifted to depths of 6 and 8 feet. The temperature had begun to rise but remained well below zero. They returned to assess damage and bury the dead. Spring of 1848 brought survivors together to rebuild what the blizzard had destroyed. 5 families had lost members to the cold. 12 cabins required major repairs or complete reconstruction. The settlement, already small and scattered, contracted further as some families chose to leave the territory entirely. Those who remained carried the knowledge that conventional construction had failed when conditions exceeded normal parameters. The conversation about how to build differently began without formal meetings or collective decisions. It simply started happening. Ernst Vogel approached Jakob in April and asked directly if Jakob would help him design an underground room. Ernst had survived the blizzard in his cabin but had burned all his furniture and half his floorboards to maintain fire. He understood how close he had come to freezing. Jakob spent 2 days at Ernst's homestead, marking out dimensions, explaining excavation techniques, describing the brickwork and ventilation systems. Ernst began digging in May. Over the next 2 years, 11 more families constructed underground refuge rooms using variations of Jakob's design. Some built chambers smaller than Jakob's original. Others incorporated the underground space into new cabin construction, designing buildings specifically to include the refuge from the beginning. Otto Hartmann began stocking bricks, mortar, and cork as regular inventory items, recognizing demand. Friedrich Klein, passing through the territory again in 1849, spent a month helping 3 families with brickwork, spreading the technical knowledge required for proper construction. The technique migrated beyond the immediate settlement. Travelers carried stories of Werner's underground room to other territories. By 1852, similar designs appeared in Montana and Idaho, built by people who had heard accounts of the blizzard of '47 and decided that preparation was preferable to risk. The exact number of lives saved by these structures over the following decades is impossible to determine. Survival often goes unrecorded. But accounts from the period reference multiple instances of families surviving extreme weather, specifically because they had built underground refuge spaces that maintained livable temperatures when surface cabins failed. Jakob remarried in 1851 to a widow named Elizabeth, who had arrived in the territory with a wagon train. They had 3 children together and lived quietly on the homestead Jakob had established. He never promoted his design or sought recognition for the innovation. When people asked for help, he provided it freely. When they did not ask, he worked his land, and raised his family without drawing attention to himself. He died in September of 1873 at the age of 62, buried beside Anna on the hillside overlooking his claim. His children inherited the property, but eventually moved to larger towns as the frontier period ended. The cabin fell into disrepair. But the underground room, built with brick and engineering that exceeded frontier standards, remained structurally sound for decades after Jacob's death. The innovation he developed out of grief and necessity became part of the accumulated knowledge that helped people survive in environments that tested the limits of human endurance. Sometimes the difference between tragedy and survival is nothing more than understanding what others overlook and having the determination to build accordingly.